Hey everyone, I'm Shreya Baragada, and today we're going to be covering the AP Human Geography topic of urban models and the hierarchy of cities. Okay, so you can follow Fiveable at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube to keep up with all the upcoming streams and events. So for this stream, we're going to be covering the topics of urbanization and how it relates to cities, like the size and distribution of cities, as well as urban models. So that includes the ones that are just for North America and the ones that apply to all over the world. And then we're going to be wrapping up with 3 multiple choice questions to test your application of the knowledge that you learned throughout the stream. Okay, so first we'll start with site and situation. So can anyone define site and situation? In the chat box. It was covered in Unit 1, so it's something that also applies to this unit. So I just want to go over it again. Yes, Marcus, I think you were close. Daisy, I think you switched them around a little bit. So site is the physical characteristics of a place. So that also includes its exact location, of course. And this covers climate, any bodies of water that are nearby, topography, which is how the land is, and soil, vegetation, and altitude. And the situation is the location of a place in relation to other places. So as Marcus said, it would be the surroundings. And you usually use situation when you're talking about somewhere that's lesser known and comparing it to a well-known place, such as the city of Champaign is close to Chicago, Illinois. If I just asked you where Champaign was, you probably wouldn't know. But if I told you it was close to Chicago, you could make that connection. And that's its situation. So thank you guys for contributing. And also, site and situation influence the origin, function, and growth of cities. That's just how they relate to this topic. So for cities and urbanization, so we're going to be covering these definitions of these terms, so just stay tuned. So a city is a territory that is surrounded by legal boundaries, and it has a certain population, and obviously it has its own rules and government and stuff. And a metropolitan area is a group of adjacent cities where the overall population density is high. So an example of a metro area is the area between New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, or the tri-state area. So the cities of New York City, Newark, and Jersey City, they all have pretty high populations, and they have a pretty good economy. So that would be a metro area because the population density is high and they have pretty busy cities that are close to each other. And a metropolitan statistical area, or an MSA, is a city of 50,000 residents or more, along with the surrounding areas, which are closely connected by social and economic factors. So an example of this would be Miami. It's surrounded by Boca Raton and Fort Lauderdale, and it has those things nearby. Even though Miami is the main city and the main attraction, Fort Lauderdale is it's nearby, and they have pretty similar economies, and they share their tourism industries, so they're connected through that. And a megalopolis is pretty close to a metropolitan area, except instead of a group of just cities that are close to each other, it's connected cities that form a chain. So it almost forms a continuous urban area. So an example of this would be the Boston to Washington corridor, or the Boswash corridor. And this is where Baltimore, Boston, and Washington, D.C., along with other cities, they form this continuous chain of cities with and they all have a lot of population, good economies, and it forms this chain of urbanization. So that's kind of the difference between a megalopolis and a metropolitan area. As for urbanization, changes in transportation and communication, population growth, migration, economic development, and government policies influence urbanization. So I know that was a lot, but like we'll just like break that down. So like as transportation increases, so let's say going from like horse-drawn carriages to cars, obviously urbanization is also going to like increase with that. Communication, like going from a telegraph to a phone, that's going to also increase urbanization. Population growth and migration, like as more people start moving to the cities and like more people start uh, like going somewhere for like jobs and like job specialization, obviously the economy is also going to grow and it's going to develop as well, and that also contributes to urbanization, and the government's going to build like laws and like things around urbanization, and that just like all of those factors like contribute, and this all like influences the formation of and growth of cities. So as you can see, like for example, like Dubai, it used to be like a desert like a while ago, but now as more people start moving there and all these buildings and jobs start getting created, it becomes a city and it becomes like recognized in the global marketplace. And now it's like a huge tourist attraction and it has like a bunch of amenities that weren't there before. So urbanization is an extremely important factor in turning like just a small rural town into a big bustling city with a lot of like growth and population. And another feature that a city usually has is something called social heterogeneity, which means that there's a lot of diversity amongst the population. So when you like go to a city, you're more likely to see a lot of like different cultures and different like races. You hear like a bunch of different languages being spoken. You see different cuisines and like different restaurants like everywhere. And this is a feature of a city because there's like different types of people, which means that different people have migrated there. So there's a lot of like different cultures next to, like in the same area. And that differentiates a city from just like a small little town with like the same type of people. It's a city is like a lot more diverse and like culturally different. And yes, immigrants like to go to cities. So this kind of like relates back to like Ravenstein's laws of migration. I don't know if you know them, but yeah, immigrants are more likely to go to like a city rather than like just a small town. Some more cities across the world. So like a megacity is one of the world's largest cities with a population of at least 10 million people. So in the chat box, can anyone list a few cities other than London and Mumbai as on the slide? Like, can you list any megacities that you can think of? New York City, great. Okay, for China, it would be like a specific town. So like, yes, Shanghai or like Beijing or something. Okay, Atlanta, yes. Paris, yes, that would also be like considered a mega city. Okay, great responses, everyone. So mega cities, they basically have like a lot of influence, especially in like global trade and just like the global marketplace as in general. And since the beginning of the 20th century or like the 1900s, megacities are actually becoming more common in semi-periphery or periphery countries. So these like developing countries rather than developed countries because of their high birth rates and migration. So some more examples that like I guess weren't listed were like Cairo and Rio de Janeiro. So those are in like countries that are still developing, and a metacity is a new term that College Board wants you to know. And it's a new classification of city that has formed as megacities get even larger. So it's like a new term. And these cities have a population of over 20 million. And some of these megacities have gotten so big that they fall into this new category. And some examples would be like Tokyo, Mumbai, and Beijing. So they've gotten like really big and they've formed like a new classification of city. And we'll probably see even more growth as cities grow even more due to like migration and birth rates and stuff like that. So some more definitions. Um, this is like all of like the urbanization stuff that you need to know. So urbanization, we've talked about it before, like in the previous slides, but it's basically just the development of towns and cities. And urbanization never stops once a city is formed. So a lot of people like think of this, like I like to think of it like going from like just like small little farms to like tall like skyscrapers. Like that's what I think of when I think of urbanization. And I think of like a lot of like subways or like buses, like public transportation and all of that stuff. And this relates to the topic of urban sprawl. So, as urban areas, oh, will all cities eventually become megacities? So, all cities can't become megacities because there's like a population cap because of like food supply and all of that stuff. Like there's like limiting factors that prevent cities from getting like way too big. So usually like a country will have like one megacity at most, or like two in some rare cases. But other than that, like you usually can't have like that many megacities. That's why they're like rare, and it's like over 10 million people. Thanks for the question. Um, so back to urban sprawl. As urban areas expand outwards, usually in the form of suburbs and like cities and stuff, it's considered urban sprawl. So, can anyone try listing any like consequences of urban sprawl, like in the chat box? Yep, the environment will be wrecked, intruding on suburban areas. Yes, gentrification as well. Pollution. These are all great answers, guys. Good job. So, some other things that were enlisted were like urban sprawl causes land that could be used for agriculture to be like taken over, as well as like pollution, litter, and loss of natural areas, and like animals start dying out because, like there's less trees and more buildings instead. And decentralization is a pattern that's becoming more and more common as like cities grow. So people, businesses, and industries start moving away from the central city. So this would be like downtown, and they start moving outwards. And this kind of relates to the next topic of like suburbanization. So people move from cities to these residential areas that are in the outskirts of cities. So these suburbs have like bigger houses and like more land and like more greenery usually. And along with suburbs come boomburbs, which is another term that's like new that College Board wants you to know. And these are suburban areas with rapid growth. So a lot of people don't like the city lifestyle with like the cramped apartments and the pollution. So they want to move outwards from the city, and that's why these suburbs or boomburbs are like growing so fast. And reurbanization is when people living in the suburbs move back to the city. So they start moving from the outskirts to the center of the city again. And exurbanization is the opposite of that. So people living in the suburbs start moving even further outwards to the rural areas. So that would be like farmlands and stuff. And they form these small little communities of people that are called exurbs. So the suburbs become urbanized. So suburbs, they're called suburbs because they aren't like technically like the urban center, but they do have the same amenities and everything as like the urban center as much, but like they have more land and like bigger houses. Exurbanization. So they don't create urban sprawl because these exurbs are just like small communities of people. There's not that many people that want to move like past the suburbs into the rural areas and into the farmland. So usually it won't intrude on like the natural land. I hope that like answered you guys' questions. So the general pattern of like how like cities are arranged is like the urban center is in like the middle, like with the downtown and everything. And as you move out, you start seeing the suburbs, and farther from that is the rural areas. So that's just like the general pattern. And an edge city is a city in the periphery of a larger city, which act like urban areas in a suburban environment. So I'll be covering that later, but it's basically when there's like a suburban area, but then businesses start moving there because of decentralization. And then there's more amenities also available in these suburban areas. And so they kind of create like mini downtowns. So there's like more services and like there's also like industries also available in the suburbs, not just like the urban center of the city. Okay, so these like the size and distribution of cities can be explained by these four like ideas and theories that they like the College Board wants you to know for like the AP exam. So first, the rank size rule. It says that the nth largest city in any region will be 1 over n, the size of the largest city in that same region. So it sounds like really confusing, but think about it this way. For example, the fourth largest city in an area would be 1/4 the size of the largest city in that same area. So like the as farther you get from the largest city, like in size, the yeah, like you just keep getting like smaller and smaller from the largest city in that size. And the rank size rule usually applies to developed countries or regions such as the United States, Canada, and Australia because it shows that like the cities kind of gradually decrease in size instead of like one big city. Exponential decrease, yeah, pretty much. But like there's not like one big city with like a bunch of like small cities. It's like a gradual decrease, as Marcus said. And primate cities, it's similar to rank size rule, but it applies to developing countries. And it basically says that when the largest city in an urban region is more than twice as large as the next largest city. So it applies to these developing, so in less developed countries, there are uneven patterns in the city size. So yes, exactly, Daisy. So as you get to these like developing countries, all of these services are usually clustered in this one like major city, usually like the capital city, while the rest of the cities around it don't have any services or like very few services at all. And the primate city rule is also applied to like places with unitary governments or like really strong central governments because obviously like the services and like amenities are really good wherever the government is, but as you go farther out there aren't any local governments to foster the development of like infrastructure. So that one strong city is going to be like really good, but then everything around it is just going to be kind of like desolate and like they don't receive the same goods and services. So London is actually an example of primate cities, even though it is a developed region. But because like in that area, London is like a mega city. So it has like all these amenities and like a bunch of tourists and a bunch of like people there. And then everything around it is kind of like less well known. It's like smaller and like it doesn't have as many services. But in London, there's like really good transportation. So it's easy for people in the surrounding smaller cities to get to London to receive the services that they need. On the other hand, there's like Mexico City, where Mexico City has all these like great services and like goods and services. All the cities around it, they don't have the same services available to them. And there's also not that much transportation and infrastructure available for people to easily travel to Mexico City and receive these like same amenities as like anyone else would. So the primate city rule is basically saying that like one city is a lot better off than like everywhere else in the country. The gravity model is the idea that two different places that are larger and closer together have more interaction than two different places that are smaller and farther away. So the bigger that two cities are and the closer that they are together, they have more connection than two cities that are like really small and like far away from each other. And it's used to predict the flow of people between places. And it states that there's like more migrant flow between bigger cities and cities that are close by. Yes, back to Unit 2 with like Ravenstein's laws of migration. Like people are more likely to move to like a bigger city or a city that's like closer by. So that relates to the gravity model. And I see there's a question. As a country gets more developed, will it change to a rank-sized city? Yes, it can. It can do that. because when a city starts getting more developed, like not just that one like main city is going to grow, like all of these smaller cities around it are going to grow as well. So like and you can see this in like a lot of countries, like there's usually like one like flagship city that's like that starts out really big, but then everything else starts like catching up to it, I guess, and it moves from like the primate city to the rank size rule. So great question. Next, the central place theory, and it was developed by Walter Christaller in 1933, and this theory explains how cities of different sizes are distributed. And the central place theory is an extremely important idea from this unit because you'll see it a lot, whether it's in an FRQ or like a multiple choice question on the AP exam, and I'll explain more about it on like the next slide. So the central place theory, it's shown in that like picture on the right of the slide. And some characteristics is that there's a central place where goods and services are provided to the surrounding market area. So on this picture, the central place would be any of the like the dots or like squares or stars that mark like the center of anywhere of, and then the market area is the hexagon that surrounds the central place. And there are different levels of or sizes of settlements which are evenly distributed across the landscape. So these like little like orange hexagons, that's like the smallest level. And as you grow like and expand outwards, you get to that red hexagon. So that's like the upper level. And as you can see, these market areas are hexagons because it is like a halfway mark between having a square hinterland and a circular hinterland. So the hinterland just means like surrounding areas, and square hinterlands, when it's shaped like this, the people in the corners, they basically can't reach the center as easily as people like that are like on the sides. And like for circular hinterlands, it doesn't like overlap nicely. So the hexagon was like a nice like compromise between the two. So that's why they're like hexagons instead of any other shape. And as you can see, these little like orange sub-centers on this picture, like the goods and services that are provided within those orange hexagons or these small little market areas are usually lower order goods like necessities like toilet paper, like bread, medicines, water, like stuff like that. And then this continues and like scales up until you get to this like big red hexagon. And the central place, or this like big center, the star in the center of this image, um, this center provides luxury goods and services, and it provides it to this huge like large population within the red hexagon. And this also kind of like goes back to like the laws of migration almost, because people are a lot more willing to travel like farther distances to get luxury goods rather than they are to get like necessities. So even if I lived at one of these like black triangles at the edge of the hexagon, I would be willing to travel all the way to the red star rather than if I just wanted like a loaf of bread or something, I wouldn't travel that distance. But if I wanted like an Apple Watch or like a TV or a diamond ring, I would go that distance because it's a nice good and you want to travel the distance to get somewhere. And some oh, is this always represented? So the centers, like you mean the stars and like the squares and circles? Is that what you mean by specific shapes? Okay. So no, not necessarily. This is just what they use on the pictures. All you need to know is like the only like shape that stays the same in all the pictures are the hexagons. But I just use these like shapes to like make it easier to like visualize the different like levels of um central places and like market areas. It makes it easier to visualize. For disadvantages of this central place theory model, the land isn't always like perfectly flat, allowing for even distribution of goods and services. And also people aren't evenly distributed across the landscape, so it doesn't make like perfect hexagons all the time, like in the real world. And people don't always go to the nearest center to buy goods and services. For internal structure of cities, so this is, we're gonna like move into the urban models now. And each urban model is kind of based around this concept called the Central Business District, or CBD. And the CBD is an important concept which is referenced in the upcoming models. And some of its characteristics are that the services and like goods are concentrated in this area. There's a lot of skyscrapers and tall buildings usually found here. The land value is very high, and if any, there's any residential portions are characterized by high density housing, like really tall apartment buildings with like really small apartments within them. And manufacturing isn't done here because factories are like really big, and since land is so expensive, like in the central business district, there's no room to build like a huge factory because then everything would become like a lot more expensive. So the central business district is where all like the businesses are, and like that would be like the downtown of the city. And the first model is the concentric zone model, and it was developed by E.W. Burgess in the 1920s. And this model represents the city as a series of rings that expands outwards from the CBD. So in this image, the CBD is this like yellow circle in the middle. And the zone of transition is also like used in other models as well. And it's basically an area that is used for industry and very low quality housing. So this is like the pink ring on this model. And as you move out, like the third ring is working class housing. The fourth ring is like higher quality housing, so for like middle class people. And the fifth ring is for like really large homes, and like this includes like suburban areas on the city's edge. And this is for like upper class and like upper middle class. And this is also known as the commuter zone. And the farther you get from the CBD in this model, you see that land is more affordable and available, and houses are bigger and better, and there's lower population density. And this relates back to the bid rent theory that you guys learned in the agriculture unit. So this kind of looks like von Thunen's model, if you can see the difference, like the similarities between the two models. And as you get farther out, the land is cheaper, so and like there's more of it available rather than in the center where it's more expensive and there's just like less of it available. The sector model was developed by Homer Hoyt in the 1930s, and just like the previous model, the CBD is represented by that like yellow circle in the center. And this transportation center, which is this like burnt orange color, it runs, oh, the zone of transition. It's this pink ring that is used for industry and low quality housing. So like all the factories and like the really like small homes that like factory workers live in, that's basically the zone of transition. So back to the sector model, the transition sector is this like orange sector, like the dark orange, and it runs from the edge of the city to the center of the city. And this is where like all the trucks and like all the trains that like transport materials go. And this causes the industry sector to lay like right next to it. So the light orange sector is right next to the transportation sector, because obviously like as factories like produce products and like materials, and they also import raw materials in, they need transportation like readily available to transport, like to export and import materials. So that's why they're like right next to each other. And then as you can see, these pink zones, these low rent, like low income, low quality houses surrounding the industry and transport sectors, because like the factory workers live in these like small houses like around these areas, so they're like closer to their job. And high income houses extend in the opposite direction. This is for like the upper class. It goes like in the exact opposite direction of the lower class housing. And it has a sector inside it for education and recreational amenities. So this like little green area, it has like parks and like nice things like gyms, rec centers, like all of that stuff. And then the middle class houses is this like light purple transition zone between the low income and high income housing for like people in the middle class. The multiple nuclei model was developed by Chauncey Harris and Edward Ullman in the 1940s. And it is based on the idea that there were multiple nodes, and it results in this kind of like grid of land uses, and each of these like land areas has like a respective like center that it's like based around. And I know what you're thinking, this is like a really complicated model, but I promise you don't have to like memorize it like each sector, like each model is going to be a little different. And yeah, every decade better theory, honestly. So like the theories kind of get more complicated. So the multiple nuclei is kind of like the truest to how cities are today. So there's like a central business district with like industry around it and like low class residential, but there's also this new concept of an outlying business district that's like kind of like an edge city, as we talked about before, like a mini downtown. It's like an external CBD, and it's surrounded by the middle class and high class housing. So these industrial zones that are around the central business district also have like the high density, like the low quality housing, while this like light tan outlying business district is surrounded by like business parks and universities and like the nicer things. And that's basically like the concept of the multiple nuclei model, that there's like two different, or like more than two actually, centers of like business. So there's like that main CBD, but there's also like outlying business districts that have their own like amenities around them. And usually the outlying business district is the one that's surrounded by like the nicer homes and like the suburbs, while the CBD still has that like manufacturing and industry environment around it. And the three models that we just covered, like the sector model, concentric zone, and multiple nuclei, these three models are the classic models used to describe cities in North America. So as we move forward, we'll talk about like cities around the world and models used to describe those. So this is actually a variation on the multiple nuclei model. It's also known as the Galactic City or Peripheral model, developed by Harris. And it is characterized by an increasingly decentralized CBD with a lot of suburban migration. So as we go back to the topic of decentralization, like people, they don't want to live in the downtown with like the really small apartments and pollution and all of that. So they start moving outwards to these edge cities and the suburbs, and they want like the nicer houses, like more greenery. And the central city is surrounded by a ring road along which are these suburban areas. So the ring road is that like gray line that goes around the whole city, and those little like things on the edge are like kind of like edge cities, suburban areas, office parks, little industrial areas and service centers, and they act as like mini downtowns. So they're like external from the CBD, kind of going back to like that new multiple nuclei model. It's like an external CBD. It's like not the actual central business district, but it like acts as it, and it has like pretty similar amenities and like services available there as well. Yeah, I think Texas cities are pretty much like this from what I've seen. Yeah. And the Galactic City model is also a lot more like accurate to what cities you see in America today. And moving on to like global cities. So this is the Latin American model. So it's also known as the Griffin-Ford model. So the CBD has two parts. One half of it is the traditional market center with like little like bazaars and stuff like that. And there's the other half of it, which is like a modern high-rise center with like skyscrapers and stuff. And coming off of this like modern part of the CBD is something called the commercial spine. And this contains like along the spine are like theaters, restaurants, parks, and like other amenities. And the wealthy live, like the upper class people live along the spine and in the inner city, like the CBD area. And this is different from the North American concentric zone model because the quality of housing, as you can see, it decreases as the distance from the center increases. So it's actually nicer to live in the CBD than it is to live in the outskirts of town, which is like the exact opposite of what we have in North America. And if you look at this picture, the spine ends at this secondary center So it kind of is like an outlying business district, and it's called a mall. I don't know if it's an actual mall, but it's just called a mall. And the outer ring, or the periférico, has poverty, little infrastructure, and shanty towns. So this is where like the lower class people live, and it all like all the slums and stuff. Yes, Latin American cities. These are the ones in South and Central America. Yes. And favelas or barrios are not connected to city services. So these are contained in the disamenity zones that you see like right next to the periferico. And these favelas or barrios have a lot of high like poverty rates, homelessness, and crime rates because they're usually not like under direct control of the city. So they have like a lot of like bad environments there. And as you move out, you see public transportation, water supply, and electricity decreasing or even disappearing. And the industrial park is on the opposite side of the wealthy zone, and this is near like the middle class houses and near the lower class houses. So it's like right next to like where people working in factories would live. So like right between lower and middle class houses. And it's opposite from the upper class houses. For European cities, you don't actually need to like know the model because it's kind of like an approximation. Like this model is very like approximate, but there's some like concepts that you need to know. So one of them is that there's like a lack of distinct land use zones. So there's no like defined like middle class zone. It's kind of just like everything like blends into each other. And a lot of European cities are based around their medieval and pre-industrial like architecture. So you see like a lot of like stone walls and like cobblestone streets and like all of that stuff. And the CBD and the suburbs in the European city model is a lot different than in the other models because in the CBD usually you think of like skyscrapers and like really tall buildings, but in Europe um, the European governments actually limit new construction and they limit building height to preserve the historic quality of European cities. So buildings are actually shorter in the central business district. And it also has a lot more residents than in like any other CBD. So people are more likely to live in the central business district and they live in low rise apartments, like actually short apartments with like a little more space. And there's also like small businesses in the central business district, like farmers markets and like other stuff to accommodate for the increase of residents living in the central business district. Yeah, like Paris, exactly. And as you move out to the suburbs, you see these taller buildings actually, like they can be taller than the central business district. And they have like high-rise apartments with higher population densities. And the suburbs are actually where like you see a lot more ethnic diversity because people like when they move in, they see like the tall apartments and then they're usually like compelled to settle in the suburbs rather than the central business district because the central business district is more like traditional European culture. It's like it's not more welcoming as much as the suburbs, and the suburbs have a lot of residents from the old colonies that Europe used to inhabit. So, for example, Britain, like in London, the suburbs of London, they have like a lot of like Indian people living there because India used to be one of Britain's colonies. So that's one interesting feature that's unique to the European model. For African cities, there's actually like three parts to the central business district. The traditional CBD existed even before all the European colonization happened, and it has both those like little small like shops and like permanent stores. So it's a little more like informal than the rest. And the colonial CBD is like the exact opposite. And it has these like huge, like straight avenues with like big homes and parks and offices. And this is because these European countries came and like settled into Africa, and they kind of like divided it up into pieces, and they established their own like architecture and like systems. So that's why it's a lot nicer in the colonial part of the CBD. And then there's this last informal economy zone part of the CBD, which has these like informal businesses with like temporary employees and like periodic markets with like merchants. So this is like seasonal farmers markets and all of that stuff. And aside from the CBD, there's these residential areas around it, and people are usually divided by ethnicity in the African city model because of when the Europeans came in, they divided Africa however they wanted. So a lot of different ethnicities were actually placed next to each other in the same like city rather than in like their own distinct countries like they used to be. So they naturally divided into their own like little ethnic enclaves in this residential area. And as you move further out, the periphery has informal settlements with high population density and low planning, as well as lack of public services like electricity, water, and sewage. And in the periphery, you also see these things called squatter settlements, and it's similar to the Latin American barrios, and it also has like the high rates of like drugs, crime, and disease. And people usually settle in the squatter settlements when there's like a lot of mass migration because they can't all settle into the residential area at once. So, and they also can't find a job immediately. So they tend to just like move into these informal settlements, which are like really dangerous and like low quality. So, yeah. For Middle Eastern and Islamic cities, so the central feature, instead of like a CBD, it's usually the principal mosque or like the Great Mosque. So this like black rectangle in the middle of this picture. And the citadel, which is includes the walls, forts, and towers that were used to defend the city in the past, they are usually still existing today. Like if you go to a Middle Eastern country, like or like a city within a Middle Eastern country, you're likely to see these walls and like gates still existing. So that's considered the citadel. And there's also smaller mosques around the city as the city grows, and major roads come from the outer gates towards the center and these roads are like lined with bazaars, so like small little markets and like merchants. And luxury items are sold near the center, while bulky and less valuable items are sold near the wall and the gates, because it's a lot like people want to buy like nicer things near the heart of the city, and like the cheaper things, the heavier things, as they come into the city, they're just sold in the outer rings and they're not like brought all the way in since they're cheap. For Southeast Asian cities, it's also known as the McGee model, and it's focused around a former colonial port zone. So when Europeans colonized Southeastern Asian like countries, they started port zones to establish trade with their home countries. So these cities are usually based around this port city, and capital cities in these Southeast Asian countries have commercial zones with foreign merchants and ambassadors like around them. And many of these cities have something called a secondary commercial zone of like Chinese businesses due to a lot of Chinese immigration to Southeast Asian countries. Because, like, for an example of this would be like a lot of Chinese people moving to like Indonesia for like labor. So they kind of start their own little like communities with their own little like commercial zone and like Chinese businesses and Chinese restaurants. And market gardening, like this market gardening zone on the outside, it kind of surrounds and feeds the city. And like within that, there's like, of course, the suburbs and like middle class housing and lower class housing as well. And this port zone, this pink area that's like at the bottom of the picture, does a lot of like exports, and it's kind of similar to the central business district that you see in the North American model. So now we're going to move on to the multiple choice questions. The first one has to do with urban models. Which urban model is likely to have a city with edge cities around its beltways? So you can like put the letter of the answer choice in the chat box. Okay, so I'm seeing A for Marcus, and that's correct. Good job. So, like you might not remember this because we did it at the beginning of the stream, but it was a variation on the multiple nuclei model. So the city was actually surrounded by this huge ring road, also known as a beltway, I guess. And it has those edge cities along the beltway, so it's like surrounded by those edge cities. So good job, Marcus. The next question has to do with global city models. So what feature of many large American cities is shown by Mexico City's Paseo de la Reforma, a wide avenue lined by trees, large office buildings, and mansions? So this picture is a picture of that. So A, the Periferico, B, the disamenity zone, C, the commercial spine, D, the favelas, or E, the transition zone. So I'm seeing C, and that is correct. Good job. So this commercial zone is like lined with like businesses and like really nice like amenities and like trees and stuff. And that's also where like the wealthy people are like likely to live. So good job, Daisy and Marcus. And the last question is about the size and distribution of cities. So Mumbai and Karachi are two heavily populated cities which are only 883 kilometers away from each other. They are closely connected by trade and by flow of migrants. Which concept does this best illustrate? A, rank size rule, B, primate cities, C, bid rent theory, D, gravity model, or E, central place theory? So I'm seeing both D and A, and the correct answer is actually D. So good job, Daisy. Um, so the gravity model, so this actually demonstrates the gravity model because it says that they are close together in distance, as you can see on the map as well, and they're like closely connected. So I think you may have gotten the rank size rule like confused with like the size of the cities. That was probably why, like with the heavily populated, I understand why, but this like best describes the gravity model. So good job to both of you. And that is it for today's stream. And remember to follow Fiveable and like keep up on like Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And we're done with the stream for today. So if you guys have any more questions, feel free to put it in the chat box. And yeah, so this is like one of like the last units in AP Human Geography. So you're almost done. You're almost there. So great job, everyone. Thank you for being like responsive and like participating in everything. You guys are great. No problem. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll like end the live stream. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, bye guys.